Betrayal is often whispered behind closed doors, but sometimes it unfolds in the harsh glare of hospital lights. Picture a luxurious private ward, the antiseptic scent mingling with the heavy tension in the air. A husband paces nervously, his eyes darting between the bed where his wife writhes in labor and the door that's about to reveal his biggest secret, his pregnant mistress. The stakes are higher than anyone can imagine. A multi-million-dollar empire, two women about to give birth at the same time, and a single set of documents that could topple a dynasty. Welcome to a story where one signature changes everything overnight. David Harrington stood on the sprawling terrace of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Manhattan, overlooking Central Park's lush green canopy. It was the eve of his wedding to Catherine Wilson, the only daughter of Robert Wilson, a man known for his formidable real estate empire that spanned from New York's skyscrapers to exclusive villas in Monaco. Dressed in a bespoke Brioni tuxedo, David cradled a glass of champagne. He felt on top of the world. Surrounded by the city's skyline, a multi-million-dollar trust waiting for him after his nuptials, and a future wife who was not only breathtakingly beautiful but also fiercely intelligent, it seemed like life had rolled out a golden carpet just for him. Catherine emerged from the double doors leading to the terrace, a vision, in an elegant white gown embroidered with delicate pearls. She wore the family heirloom diamond necklace, a gift passed down through generations of Wilson women. To David, she was the epitome of grace and class, someone he both admired and feared. Her sharp mind was evident in the way she had attended Wharton School of Business and had a seat at her father's board meetings before she even turned 25. Though her father was sometimes overbearing, Catherine commanded a different kind of respect earned through her unyielding devotion to the company and its people. That night, as they danced under the stars, while a quartet played a refined melody, David promised himself that no matter what happened in the future, he would honor Catherine. He saw her as his partner, not just in love, but also in the ambition that fueled their grand plans. Their wedding day shimmered with champagne toasts and paparazzi flashes. The leading tabloids heralded the union as the wedding of the decade, complete with cameo appearances by famous business magnates like Warren Buffett and Bill Gates, longtime family friends of the Wilsons. No one could have predicted how drastically their lives would change in the years to come. Their vow till death do us part might have sounded like a fairy tale, but the real story was shaped by secrets hidden behind the gilded walls of their Manhattan penthouse. 3 years passed since that star-studded wedding. From the outside, David and Catherine seemed like a perfect power couple, partners at exclusive charity galas, always photographed arm in arm. Their names were inked together on philanthropic boards, and their combined net worth made them the darlings of business magazines worldwide. However, beneath the polished exterior, problems began to surface. Catherine devoted long hours to managing her father's real estate empire. Even after Robert Wilson partially stepped back to enjoy his retirement, Catherine threw herself into numerous business expansions, from developing sustainable skyscrapers in the heart of New York to establishing real estate footprints in emerging cities across Asia. She would spend days in Shanghai or Dubai, returning only to catch her breath before embarking on another trip. In her absence, David felt increasingly sidelined. He too had business interests, some inherited from his own family's smaller but still significant manufacturing firm, but he lacked Catherine's relentless drive. Their daily conversations shifted from sweet nothings to board meeting agendas and property acquisitions. David soon realized he wasn't simply overshadowed, he was close to being irrelevant in Catherine's grand scheme. Late at night, when Catherine came home exhausted, their intimacy had dwindled to a few mumbled words before she collapsed into bed. He first felt the sting of neglect at a Wilson Enterprises function. Catherine was busy discussing a new venture with her father and potential investors, including some big names from Silicon Valley. David lingered awkwardly at the periphery, a glass of whiskey in hand. He attempted to chime in, but found that his perspectives were dismissed or overshadowed by Catherine's precise knowledge. When reporters asked them to stand together for photographs, Catherine gave him a cursory smile before returning to her circle of business heavyweights. Soon after, Catherine's father suggested that David should take a more supportive role in the expansions. He recommended David focus on philanthropic projects, effectively steering him away from the core real estate dealings. Although couched in polite language, David grasped that he was being sidelined, perhaps even belittled. It stung his pride severely. That was the moment David began to question his entire relationship with Catherine. Was he truly a partner in her life, or just an attractive sidekick who had been given a seat at the table out of courtesy? The seeds of resentment took root. Each day, his disillusionment grew stronger, fueled by Catherine's unstoppable rise and Robert Wilson's tight control of the empire. The unraveling began on a sweltering summer afternoon in Manhattan. David had just wrapped up a lackluster lunch meeting with an investor who politely declined to fund his new venture. Feeling dejected, he walked into the Mark Hotel's bar, drawn by the promise of air conditioning and a stiff drink. That's where he first met Elena Moore. Elena was a vivacious woman with striking green eyes and dark hair that fell in cascading waves around her shoulders. She looked slightly out of place among the suited clientele, more bohemian than corporate, wearing a simple sundress paired with dangling earrings. She was editing photographs on a tablet, an iced coffee in front of her. When David slid onto the bar stool next to her to order a drink, their eyes met in the reflection of the bar's mirrored shelves. A spark, that intangible jolt, passed between them. Elena politely smiled before returning to her work, but David was intrigued. It wasn't just her beauty, there was a carefree confidence about her. It formed a stark contrast to the rigid, high society circles he was used to. Feeling an unusual sense of boldness, David started a conversation. Elena turned out to be a freelance photojournalist who traveled around the globe to capture human interest stories, from documenting life in remote corners of Africa to covering political rallies in Eastern Europe. She was in Manhattan for a short stint working on a feature about the city's lesser-known neighborhoods. Their conversation flowed effortlessly, from her adventurous travels to David's background in manufacturing and philanthropic work. One topic led to another, and David found himself sharing personal stories he never thought he'd divulge to a stranger, let alone a woman he had just met. He spoke about his frustrations with Catherine's empire building, how he felt overshadowed and emasculated. Eleanor listened empathetically, occasionally offering a supportive comment or sharing her own experiences of feeling like an outsider. It was a refreshing change for David, who was accustomed to either being dismissed or having every word scrutinized by those in Catherine's world. Eleanor seemed genuinely interested, her expressions shifting from curiosity to sympathy. By the time he paid the bill, an unspoken bond had formed between them. They exchanged numbers with a loose promise to meet again. And David stepped out onto the bustling Manhattan street, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time: exhilaration. He told himself it was just a friendly connection, but deep down he sensed the danger of his own longing for companionship, one that Catherine no longer provided. In the following weeks, David found himself increasingly drawn to Elena's free spirit. He would invent errands or slip away from business functions early to meet her in hidden corners of the city, a quiet coffee shop in Brooklyn Heights, a small jazz bar in Harlem, or the reading room of the New York Public Library. The city was vast and offered them anonymity, a chance to explore each other's worlds away from prying eyes. Each meeting intensified the gravitational pull between them. Elena introduced David to parts of Manhattan he never cared to see, neighborhoods brimming with immigrant cultures, food markets offering flavors from around the globe, and small art galleries showcasing emerging artists. She allowed him to see a version of New York that wasn't all gleaming skyscrapers and exclusive penthouses. Meanwhile, Catherine was oblivious, lost in a whirlwind of board meetings and business trips. On nights when David returned late, offering vague excuses about networking events, she was often too tired to probe further. Their communication had become so surface level that Catherine rarely pressed him for details. She was content to see him engaged in something that kept him out of her father's crosshairs. What started as emotional intimacy soon turned physical. It happened one evening in Elena's modest apartment in the Lower East Side. They'd been sharing a bottle of wine, discussing her latest photography assignment. The conversation gave way to soft gazes, lingering touches, and finally, a passionate embrace. In that moment, David felt alive in a way he hadn't experienced for years, desired, important, free from Catherine's shadow. Days turned into weeks, and the affair blossomed in secret. David shuttled between the gilded corridors of the Wilson family business events and Elena's bohemian sanctuary, living a double life that he felt strangely capable of juggling. Guilt gnawed at him occasionally, especially when he saw Catherine's exhausted face each night. Yet the lure of Elena's affection was too strong. He rationalized his actions. Catherine had her empire to run, her father's approval to maintain. She never had time for him anyway. In the midst of this secret life, David failed to notice subtle changes at home. Catherine's silent disappointment, her puzzled expressions when she realized David was slipping away from her emotionally. Their conversations were polite but lacked warmth. They slept on the same bed, yet felt continents apart. And David, consumed by his clandestine meetings, never suspected that Catherine might be planning something of her own. It was during a high-profile fundraising gala for the Wilson Foundation that the first bombshell dropped. Catherine had spent weeks organizing the event, securing high-profile donors, including cameo appearances by philanthropic giants like Bill Gates. Dressed in a sleek midnight blue gown, she welcomed each guest with measured grace, all while checking her phone for an important message she expected that night. David, on the other hand, found himself exchanging forced pleasantries with business leaders. At times, he could feel Catherine glancing at him from across the room, as though trying to gauge his mood. There was tension in the air, something neither of them wanted to address in such a public setting. Just before the keynote speech, Catherine took the microphone. She thanked everyone for attending, praised the generosity of the donors, and emphasized the foundation's commitment to housing the homeless, a project close to her heart. Then she dropped the news that stunned David to his core. As some of you may know, Catherine began, her voice slightly trembling. "My husband, David, and I are expecting our first child. We couldn't be happier to share this joyous moment with all of you." The audience erupted in applause. Cameras flashed incessantly. For a moment, David stood frozen, a forced smile plastered on his face. He had no idea Catherine was pregnant. They had discussed starting a family in the abstract, but Catherine had never explicitly mentioned a pregnancy. He felt a rush of conflicting emotions: disbelief, shock, guilt, and an odd sense of pride. Catherine set down the microphone, and David quickly recovered his composure enough to join her on stage, hugging her softly for the cameras. Under the glaring lights and watchful eyes of the city's elite, they appeared to be the perfect couple, basking in the glow of impending parenthood. But inside David's mind, the puzzle pieces started rearranging themselves. This child changed everything. Where did Elena fit into this scenario? Later that night, as they returned to their penthouse, David mustered the courage to congratulate his wife properly. Catherine was emotionally drained, but an unmistakable joy radiated from her. She explained that her doctor had confirmed the pregnancy only 2 weeks ago, and she wanted to ensure everything was stable before breaking the news. Her eyes glistened with tears of happiness, though David noticed hints of concern, even sadness, in her gaze. In their lavish bedroom, dominated by floor-to-ceiling windows showcasing the sparkling Manhattan skyline, David reached out to Catherine. There was a moment of raw emotion as he placed a hand on her belly, feeling the life they had inadvertently created. He whispered, "I'm here, Catherine. For you, for the baby. I promise." He meant it. In that fleeting second, yet a part of him remained tied to Elena, and the knowledge of that betrayal churned a deep pit in his stomach. Despite the joyous facade, David was far from settled. The weight of Catherine's pregnancy pressed on him day and night, overshadowing the giddy moments he once shared with Elena. He tried to distance himself from Elena for a time, even contemplating ending the affair. After all, Catherine carried his child, and the moral guilt now felt heavier than ever. But fate had other plans. One late afternoon, David was reading reports at a quiet coffee shop in Soho, a place Catherine never frequented, when Elena walked in. She looked pale, her usual confident demeanor replaced with apprehension. David's heart pounded as she approached his table, eyes brimming with an urgency he couldn't ignore. "I have something to tell you," she said quietly, taking a seat across from him. Her voice quivered, and she nervously wrung her hands in her lap. David's mind reeled with questions. Was she breaking things off? Had she discovered Catherine's pregnancy? Before he could say anything, Elena spoke words that would forever alter the direction of his life. "I'm pregnant, David," she said, "and it's yours." Silence enveloped them, disrupted only by the faint hum of the cafe's air conditioner. David's breathing grew shallow. The shock was more profound than anything he'd experienced before. He leaned in closer, his voice barely a whisper. "Are you sure?" Elena nodded, tears threatening to spill from her eyes. She explained she had confirmed it with her doctor a few days ago, and like Catherine, she wanted to ensure it wasn't a false alarm before telling him. A wave of panic washed over David. 2 pregnancies, 2 women, his wife and his mistress, carrying his children at the same time. The magnitude of his betrayal loomed monstrously before him. As he stared at Elena, he noticed she looked exhausted, yet determined, as though she had rehearsed this scenario in her mind. "What do you plan on doing?" David asked, his tone betraying his anxiety. He instantly regretted the phrasing. It sounded too transactional, too cold. Elena bit her lip, struggling to maintain composure. "I don't know," she admitted. "I never planned on this, but I want this child. I can't imagine." Her voice trailed off, leaving the unspoken words hanging between them. In that moment, David realized the full extent of his responsibility. 2 women, each of whom was set on bringing his child into the world. The carefully constructed double life he had maintained was on the verge of collapsing like a house of cards. And with Catherine's father, Robert Wilson, in the background, the fallout promised to be catastrophic. Robert was known for his ruthless business tactics, and David couldn't even fathom how he would react if he discovered that David had impregnated another woman. Elena, sensing David's turmoil, reached across the table and clasped his hand. "I don't want to ruin your life," she said, tears glistening. "But I need to know if you're going to be there for us." David squeezed her hand, torn between his moral obligations and the powerful fear that gnawed at him. "I need time," he whispered, glancing around to ensure no one was eavesdropping. "But I promise, Elena, I won't abandon you." The days that followed were a whirlwind of lies and desperate attempts to keep both pregnancies hidden from each other. David found himself rushing from Catherine's ultrasound appointments to clandestine meetings with Elena. He paid for Elena's prenatal care, ensuring she received the best medical attention available without attracting Catherine's or Robert Wilson's attention. Every visit to the hospital felt like a covert operation. On the home front, Catherine's pregnancy began to show. She was radiant, and despite her heavy workload, she appeared more serene than ever. Her father hired additional staff for Wilson Enterprises, allowing Catherine more flexibility. She gratefully accepted the help, eager to find balance as she prepared for motherhood. Over quiet dinners at home, Catherine would share her excitement about baby names, nursery decorations, and the future of their family. Occasionally, she'd take David's hand in hers and thank him for staying by her side. Each of these moments was a dagger to David's conscience. Catherine was genuine, her happiness untainted by any suspicion. Yet each day, David found it harder to maintain his composure. He hated lying to her face, but fear held him captive. He envisioned the disgrace, the financial upheaval, and the personal destruction that would follow if Catherine learned about Elena. Robert Wilson noticed David's distracted behavior. One afternoon, Robert invited him to lunch at an upscale French restaurant near the Wilson Enterprises Tower. The older man was in a surprisingly cordial mood, or so it seemed. Between bites of lobster bisque, Robert probed David with deceptively casual questions about his future plans, philanthropic interests, and most alarmingly, where David's priorities lay now that Catherine was pregnant. David answered as smoothly as he could, attributing his stress to the pressure of impending fatherhood and his own business expansions. Robert nodded, but there was a glint in his eyes that put David on edge. He knew Robert Wilson wasn't one to ignore unusual patterns of behavior in his inner circle. David left the lunch feeling as though he'd just danced with the devil. Meanwhile, Elena's pregnancy progressed. Their secret rendezvous became more somber. The thrill of forbidden romance had evaporated, replaced by uneasy discussions about the future. Elena asked David if he'd be present for the birth. David evaded a direct answer, vaguely mentioning that he'd figure something out. He felt torn between moral duty and the looming shadow of Catherine's father. And so the tension stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap at any moment. David balanced precariously on the edge of discovery, knowing full well that one misstep would plunge him into catastrophe. As Catherine's due date approached, Robert Wilson decided to host a small family gathering at his Hamptons estate. He wanted to celebrate Catherine's upcoming motherhood in a more intimate setting. The gathering was modest, by Wilson standards, just a few close family friends, business partners, and some extended relatives. David arrived late, his mind adrift in anxieties about Elena, who had been messaging him constantly. She was experiencing severe morning sickness and had urged him to be by her side. His lateness didn't go unnoticed. Catherine's face darkened with concern, though she tried to hide it behind a polite smile for the guests. During the dinner, Robert offered a toast to Catherine and David. He praised Catherine's resilience and David's steadfast support. David forced a grateful smile, swallowing the guilt that threatened to choke him. After dinner, Robert pulled David aside, escorting him to a dimly lit study adorned with antique leather-bound books and hunting trophies. The conversation started innocently enough. Robert inquired about David's new venture ideas, and David obliged with generic updates. Then, Robert shifted gear. He leaned forward, his voice dangerously calm. "I know, David," he said, his piercing gaze making the words feel like bullets. "Know what?" David asked, feigning ignorance. "Don't insult my intelligence," Robert snapped. "I've had you followed for some time. My daughter deserves better than a cheating husband sneaking around with a mistress." David froze. The confession hung in the air like a dagger. He felt the walls closing in on him. "How long have you known?" David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert let out a mirthless laugh. "Long enough to know she's pregnant. You've made a mockery of this family. And you do this while Catherine carries your child." David's initial inclination was to deny everything, but Robert's steely confidence left no room for doubt. He had evidence, private investigators' photographs, maybe even hospital records. Overcome by shame, David bowed his head. "What do you plan to do?" he asked, apprehension seizing every muscle in his body. "I haven't decided," Robert replied. "But understand this, if you break Catherine's heart, you'll lose everything. Your trust, your stake in the companies, your reputation. It'll all be dust. I can end you with a single phone call." Robert's threat was clear. David was to remain silent, keep up appearances, and cause Catherine no distress. Otherwise, Robert would unleash hell. With that, the older man strode out of the study, leaving David trembling amidst the relics of Wilson family power. That night, David barely slept. Lying beside Catherine in the ornate guest bedroom, he stared at the ceiling, haunted by Robert's ultimatum. The next morning, he left early, citing an emergency meeting in the city. In truth, he escaped to Elena's apartment, where he divulged everything Robert had said. Elena, frightened and pregnant, clung to David. She pleaded for assurance that he wouldn't abandon her. In that moment, David realized he was living a tragic farce, hopelessly ensnared in his lies, overshadowed by Robert's threat, and compelled to comfort his mistress while his wife carried his other child. Little did he know, events were about to unfold that would render Robert's threats trivial compared to the cataclysm Catherine herself was about to set into motion. A few weeks later, Catherine went into labor in the midst of a family brunch at the penthouse. Her sudden contractions caught everyone off guard. David rushed her to Mount Sinai Hospital, with Robert Wilson following in a separate car. By the time Catherine was admitted, her contractions were coming fast and strong. Nurses prepped her for the delivery, urging David to remain calm and supportive. Meanwhile, Elena, coincidentally, was also near her due date, and fate, ever the master orchestrator of chaos, stepped in. Elena's water broke that same afternoon. She arrived at the emergency department of Mount Sinai, escorted by a taxi driver who frantically pushed her wheelchair to the nearest triage nurse. Elena, drenched in sweat and pain, managed to utter David's name as her emergency contact. Through a mixture of hospital bureaucracy and the twist of destiny, word reached David that a woman named Elena Moore was also in labor just a few doors down from Catherine's room. Panic welled up inside him. He could barely focus on Catherine's screams or the doctor's instructions. Every beep of the hospital monitors seemed to echo the pounding of his heart. Could there be a more terrifying scenario than his wife and mistress delivering babies at the same hospital, at the same time, in the hallway? David's mind spun with indecision. Catherine's pained cries tugged at his conscience. But Eleanor needed him as well. As he lingered outside the double doors of the labor ward, Robert Wilson appeared, flanked by two stern-faced attorneys. The older man's gaze flicked to a set of hospital charts, his jaw clenching. "You have to be joking," Robert muttered under his breath, realizing Eleanor's presence. "Get rid of her," he snapped at one of his attorneys. David, incensed, lashed out. "She's carrying my child, too." Robert's face turned livid. "You'll ruin Catherine's life for that woman. You forget what we can do." Before David could respond, a nurse emerged, signaling that Catherine was calling for her husband. Tearing himself away from Robert's fury, David returned to Catherine's side. The sight of her in agony, sweat matted on her brow, forced him to refocus. He cradled her hand as the doctors instructed her to push. Catherine's screams filled the room, mingling with David's whispered encouragement. At precisely 3:48 p.m., Catherine delivered a baby girl. Overwhelmed by emotion, David cut the umbilical cord and held his daughter for the first time. She was tiny, her cries piercing the hush of the hospital room. Tears streaked Catherine's face, and for an instant, David felt pure joy until he remembered Elena was also in labor. A nurse discreetly entered the room, tapping David on the shoulder. "Mr. Harrington, Ms. Moore is asking for you." Catherine, exhausted, but still sharp, caught the name. Her eyes widened. "Ms. Moore?" she echoed. Then she noticed David's guilty expression. "Who is that?" David stammered for an explanation, but the words refused to come out. Before he could formulate a coherent excuse, Robert Wilson strode in, forcing a reassuring tone for Catherine's sake. "Don't worry, my dear, everything is fine." To David, however, he shot a deathly glare. In a fog of conflicting duties, David found himself standing at the threshold of Elena's room just minutes later. She too had delivered a baby boy, her face twisted, with both pain and relief. As David stepped closer, she handed him the child, tears sliding down her cheeks. "He's yours," she whispered. "He's ours." Outside, an astute nurse noticed David moving between the two rooms. Hospital staff began whispering rumors, spreading like wildfire through the corridors. A mistress giving birth at the same time as a legitimate wife. The scandal was too salacious to remain hidden. Somehow, Catherine pieced together enough fragments: David's sudden disappearance from her side, the presence of a woman named Elena Moore, and the tension emanating from her father, to confront the painful truth. Lying in the hospital bed, she insisted that David speak to her privately. The nurses ushered everyone out, leaving the two alone with their newborn daughter. Catherine's eyes brimmed with tears that threatened to spill at any moment. "Tell me what's going on," she demanded, voice trembling. David's heart sank. The weight of his betrayal was too immense to hide any longer. He confessed everything in fragmented sentences: his affair with Elena, her pregnancy, how he struggled to extricate himself from the situation. With each revelation, Catherine's face paled, tears falling silently. She clutched her baby to her chest, as though seeking solace from the tiny life in her arms. By the time David finished, Catherine was sobbing softly. Anger, hurt, and heartbreak all clouded her features. With trembling hands, she pressed the call button for a nurse. "I'm done hearing this," she said, her voice cold. Robert Wilson, waiting just outside, strode in upon her request. Catherine locked eyes with her father, who gave her a look that mixed profound sorrow and quiet rage. She shook her head, indicating she wanted to handle this herself. Then she turned to David, voice resolute despite the tears. "I want you gone," she said. "For now, leave. Let me think." David attempted to protest, to beg for forgiveness, but Catherine wouldn't entertain him. Instead, she demanded he exit the room. The nurse approached, guiding David out into the hallway where Robert stood, flanked by his legal team and a disapproving scowl. David had no choice. With a shattered heart, he walked away, left to wander the hospital corridors aimlessly. His world had collapsed in a single day. He was a father twice over, yet estranged from Catherine and overshadowed by Robert's threats. In an impulsive act of desperation, he rushed to Eleanor's side, but she too sensed the shift in the air. Though she was relieved David had at least come to her, the knowledge that Catherine was aware left Elena shaken, uncertain about her own future with him. Little did David know, Catherine's heartbreak would soon metamorphose into something more powerful, a calculated plan to protect her child and avenge her own dignity. For 3 days, Catherine refused to see David or even speak to him on the phone. She remained in a private suite at the hospital, recovering with her newborn daughter. Robert Wilson positioned a small army of security personnel around her, ensuring no unwelcome visitors got through without explicit permission. During this time, Catherine had a series of urgent discussions with her father's legal team, poring over prenuptial agreements and trust fund stipulations. Robert, though enraged at David, was primarily concerned with preserving the Wilson legacy. But Catherine had a different perspective. She didn't just want David ostracized, she wanted to ensure her child would never suffer due to David's reckless transgressions. On the 4th day, Catherine summoned David to the hospital room. He entered heart-pounding to find Catherine propped up against plush pillows. She looked resolute, her face pale from the stress of recent events. In her arms, their daughter slept peacefully. Robert stood by the window, arms folded, wearing an expression that suggested something monumental was about to happen. "I'm leaving the hospital tomorrow," Catherine began, quietly looking straight at David. "I can't trust you anymore. But before I do, there's something we need to settle." She nodded at Robert, who handed her a thick envelope. Catherine slipped out a set of documents and held them out to David. "Sign this," she said, her tone betraying neither anger nor mercy. David took the documents, scanning the legal jargon. His eyes widened with every paragraph. It was an agreement effectively stripping him of all financial claims to Catherine's assets, future earnings, and trust fund funds derived from the Wilson family fortune. Additionally, it contained clauses that would force David to forfeit any position he held within Wilson Enterprises. In essence, it returned him to whatever personal assets he had before marrying Catherine, assets that were minuscule compared to the Wilson empire. "You can't be serious," David muttered, his voice cracking. He glanced at Robert for help, but the older man's expression remained impassive, as though he fully supported his daughter's decision. "I'm your husband. We have a child together." Catherine maintained her composure, stroking her daughter's soft hair. "You don't deserve to be called my husband anymore," she replied. "I won't deny you your biological rights as a father, but financially, legally, you're no longer entitled to what the Wilsons built. If you don't sign, we'll proceed with a very public, very messy lawsuit that will expose your affair, your mistress, and everything else." David realized the catastrophic implications. His family name, though moderately wealthy, was nothing compared to the Wilsons. A legal battle against Robert Wilson's well-funded team would bankrupt him, ruin his reputation, and overshadow both newborns' futures with scandal. He swallowed hard, tears burning at the corners of his eyes, and asked, "What about our daughter?" Catherine's voice wavered slightly, the only crack in her composure. "She'll always be your daughter. We'll come up with a fair custody arrangement, but you'll never see a cent of Wilson money again. I won't have my child's inheritance dragged into your affairs. Sign it. Now." David flicked his gaze to Robert, who remained silent, an implacable sentinel. Realizing he had no viable alternative, David took a pen from the bedside table. His hand shook as he scribbled his signature on each page. Catherine watched silently, tears gathering but refusing to fall. When David finished, he slumped into a chair, numb. He had in one swift motion lost his status, his financial cushion, and his wife's trust. Robert calmly collected the signed documents and slipped them back into the envelope. Catherine held her baby close and averted her gaze, her heartbreak masked by the duty she felt to protect her child. Overnight, the news broke: David Harrington and Catherine Wilson Harrington were separating under undisclosed terms. The press speculated, but had scant details. Robert Wilson's PR machinery orchestrated carefully vetted statements focusing on Catherine's health and the newborn's well-being. They cited irreconcilable differences for the split and requested privacy. Behind the scenes, David was effectively blacklisted. The day after signing the documents, he attempted to visit his office at Wilson Enterprises, only to find security escorts blocking his entrance. His company access card had been deactivated, and all personal items from his office were shipped to him in a cardboard box. Emails sent to his former colleagues bounced back with automated responses that he was no longer with the company. Worse still, Catherine froze their joint bank accounts consistent with the signed agreement. She allowed him a modest sum, an amount that was laughable compared to the millions he once controlled. But it was enough for basic living expenses. David moved out of the penthouse, renting a small apartment in the city. The stark contrast from his opulent former life to a cramped one-bedroom was like being thrust into an icy lake from a warm jacuzzi. News traveled fast in elite social circles. Invites to lavish galas vanished. Old acquaintances avoided him. Investors withdrew from any venture bearing his name. Even David's own relatives distanced themselves, fearful of angering the Wilson patriarch. Elena, now caring for their newborn son, expected David to move in with her. Initially, David did stay for a few days, but the emotional toll and the swirling controversies made their relationship turbulent. Elena resented him for not standing up to Catherine and allowing the Wilsons to dictate the terms. Meanwhile, David grappled with regret and the gnawing suspicion that he was ill-equipped to support a new family without the vast resources he once wielded. By the end of the month, David felt like a prisoner in his own life. The paparazzi occasionally hounded him, snapping unflattering photos of him pushing a stroller on the streets of Manhattan, or rummaging in his pockets to pay for groceries with a credit card that sometimes got declined. The tabloids called it the fall of David Harrington, gleefully highlighting his precipitous drop from the upper echelons of wealth. Through it all, Catherine maintained a dignified silence. Focused on her daughter and her business empire, she rarely spoke about David. When reporters cornered her at charity events, she offered curt statements, affirming her commitment to co-parenting, but refused to delve into personal details. In private, though, she battled heartbreak and betrayal, confiding in her closest friends about the bitter pill she'd been forced to swallow. For a time, David spiraled into self-pity. He spent days cooped up in his modest apartment, ignoring phone calls, ignoring emails. Elena's calls grew increasingly urgent, imploring him to be involved in their son's life. Catherine's attorney sent polite but firm notices outlining a visitation schedule for his daughter and reminding him of any missed child support payments. Each reminder was a gut punch, a testament to how drastically his life had changed. One evening, while pacing in the cramped living room, David caught sight of an old photograph. It was from his wedding day, the day he and Catherine had stood on that Ritz-Carlton terrace. They looked so genuinely happy, so full of promise. Overwhelmed by regret, David sank into his sofa, tears streaming down his face. But regret alone couldn't rebuild his life. After a particularly emotional visit with his infant daughter, her tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, David resolved to do better. He reached out to a few connections that remained. While most turned him away, one old friend from his manufacturing days, Michael Stevens, agreed to meet him for coffee. Michael had known David long before the Wilson marriage, and despite his reservations about David's recent scandals, he sympathized. Michael offered David a consulting role at his small tech startup in Brooklyn. It wasn't glamorous, nor did it pay much, but it was a job. David seized the opportunity. With each passing day, he poured himself into the work, driven by a new sense of purpose. The job was humble, but for the first time in years, he felt he was building something on his own merit, rather than coasting on the Wilson name. Meanwhile, David began therapy. The guilt, shame, and betrayal had festered for too long. In counseling sessions, he confronted his choices, his jealousy of Catherine's success, his longing for validation, the affair with Elena, and the resulting chaos. The therapy was grueling, but it offered a flicker of hope for a more stable future. He also made a concerted effort to be present for both children. Even if he and Elena argued, David insisted on participating in his son's upbringing, helping with feedings, diaper changes, and pediatric appointments. On scheduled days, he visited Catherine's penthouse to spend time with his daughter. Initially, Catherine refused to see him handing the baby over to a nanny or an assistant. But as weeks turned into months, her resentment thawed slightly enough that she would allow brief, civil conversations about the child's well-being. These slow, steady steps didn't erase David's past mistakes. They didn't win him back his fortune or Catherine's trust. But they offered a glimmer of redemption. For the first time in a long while, David felt a sliver of self-respect. Almost a year passed since that fateful day in the hospital. David had settled into a routine work at Michael's startup, regular child support payments, a fraction of the earlier sums, but still punctual, and shared custody arrangements. His finances were modest, his social life nearly non-existent, but he was no longer drowning in hopelessness. One afternoon, while finalizing a product pitch, David received an unexpected call from Catherine's assistant, informing him that Catherine wanted to meet. The request was surprising. They hadn't sat down face-to-face in months without lawyers mediating their discussions. Nerves gnawed at him as he arrived at a small, upscale cafe in Midtown. Catherine was already seated at a corner table, dressed elegantly in a tailored suit that reflected her position at the helm of Wilson Enterprises. She rose to greet him, and though her expression remained guarded, she didn't exhibit open hostility. They exchanged polite pleasantries. After placing their orders, Catherine spoke first. "I've been hearing from some of our mutual acquaintances that you're finding your footing. I'm glad." David nodded, heart pounding. "I'm trying. It hasn't been easy, but I'm determined to provide for our daughter and my other child." Catherine lowered her gaze as though the mention of Elena's child still stung. "I have a business proposition for you," she said, surprising David. She explained that Wilson Enterprises was venturing into a series of community development projects focused on low-income housing. After overhearing from mutual contacts that David was working in a tech startup geared towards efficiency in construction, she believed a collaboration might be mutually beneficial. David listened in astonishment. He had assumed Catherine wanted nothing to do with him professionally. This might be her way of opening a small door toward a more amicable relationship, or it could be purely a business calculation. Regardless, David appreciated the opportunity. "Why me?" he asked. "I thought you'd never trust me again." Catherine inhaled sharply, meeting his eyes. "Trust has to be earned, but I'd rather our daughter see us cooperating than fighting. And if you deliver on this project, if your solutions help keep construction costs down, then it's a win for everyone involved, especially the community." The conversation ended on a cautious yet hopeful note. David agreed to meet with Wilson Enterprises' project team. Catherine stood to leave. Before parting, she finally asked about David's son. "How is he?" David smiled a little. "He's healthy, growing fast. Elena and well, it's complicated, but I'm there for him." Catherine offered a curt nod, lingering just long enough to whisper, "I'm relieved to hear that," before she exited the cafe. Once the initial shock wore off, David realized that Catherine's proposition was both a test and an opportunity. If he failed to deliver, it would confirm all of Robert Wilson's and the family's criticisms that he was a useless opportunist. If he succeeded, it could mark a turning point, not just in his professional life, but in how Catherine perceived him. And so David poured himself into the project. He liaised between Michael's tech startup and the Wilson Enterprises development team. He studied sustainable materials, cost-efficient construction methods, and advanced project management software. Much to his own surprise, he found genuine satisfaction in the work. The days were long but fulfilling. Early mornings were spent feeding his son before taking the subway, yes, the subway into Midtown. Meetings stretched until evening, after which he'd hurry to see his daughter or take her for a stroll in Central Park, if Catherine allowed it. He found solace in small, wholesome moments, reading bedtime stories, watching his daughter gurgle in delight when he made funny faces, and witnessing his son's first steps. Catherine mostly kept a professional distance, communicating through emails or scheduled calls, but at least once a week they had to sit down together for project updates. During these meetings, Catherine's demeanor was polished, occasionally warm. David sensed her guard was still up, yet he also noticed admiration in her eyes when he presented well-researched data or creative solutions. The breakthrough came during a project site visit in Brooklyn. The project had reached a critical phase where decisions on materials could either make or break the budget. David pitched a new approach that used lightweight, energy-efficient panels. Initially, the Wilson Enterprises project manager hesitated, but Catherine, seeing the cost-benefit analysis and long-term gains, gave it the green light. Standing amidst half-constructed buildings, wearing a hard hat and safety goggles, David felt an unprecedented surge of pride. For once, he was making a name for himself, not as Catherine Wilson's husband, but as David Harrington, consultant father, and a man striving for redemption. A few months into the project, just as the collaboration gained momentum, Robert Wilson decided to pay an unannounced visit to the Brooklyn construction site. His arrival in a sleek black SUV caused a ripple of uneasy silence among the workers. David, in the middle of directing a survey, watched Robert step out, flanked by two assistants who eyed the site with thinly veiled skepticism. Catherine was also present, going over some architectural plans with the team. She approached her father, projecting calm confidence. Robert, however, wore a disapproving scowl. "I hope you're not risking the company's reputation for sentimentality," Robert remarked, giving David a cold, sidelong glance. Catherine maintained a composed smile. "This is purely a business decision, father. The efficiency we've gained is invaluable. Besides, we're fulfilling a philanthropic mission, something you once championed yourself." Robert snorted. "I champion results, not charity cases." David bristled at the insinuation but kept silent, focusing on the site plans. He knew a confrontation with Robert could jeopardize everything. Suddenly, one of the managers called them over to inspect an issue with the foundation. Without hesitation, David explained the cause, water table complications, and proposed a quick solution. Catherine nodded in agreement, impressed. Robert, forced to acknowledge David's competence, grudgingly conceded that the fix was practical. Later, when Catherine stepped away to take a phone call, Robert cornered David. "I see you're quite determined to prove your worth, Harrington," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. David drew a steady breath. "I'm here to do a job, Mr. Wilson. And yes, I want to prove I'm more than my past mistakes." Robert's eyes narrowed. "Don't ever mistake my daughter's kindness for weakness. You hurt her once. You nearly humiliated this family. Don't expect another chance." David nodded solemnly. "Understood. My only aim now is to be a good father and a competent professional." Robert stared hard at David as if trying to decipher hidden motives. Then, with a huff, he turned away. Yet David couldn't shake the sense that beneath Robert's steely exterior, a begrudging respect might be forming. After the site visit, Catherine invited David to have coffee at a nearby cafe. The tension of Robert's encounter lingered in the air, but Catherine seemed oddly calm. She sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "My father is a difficult man," she admitted. "He has reasons, but sometimes he takes it too far." David nodded, uncertain how much he should say. He settled for the truth. "I understand. He's protecting you. I made terrible mistakes. I accept the consequences." Catherine studied him for a moment. "You're not the same man I married, and you're definitely not the same man who betrayed me," she said quietly. "You're trying, and it shows." A flutter of hope touched David's heart. "I can't expect forgiveness, but I do want you to know I regret everything. I wish I could take away the pain I caused." Catherine's gaze flickered with a swirl of emotions: anger, sorrow, faint glimmers of warmth. "I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive you," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "But I want our daughter to see us getting along. She deserves that." David reached across the table, hesitated, then gently touched Catherine's hand. She didn't pull away, but she didn't hold his hand either. They spent the next hour talking about day-to-day matters, the baby's feeding schedule, potential preschools, and the status of the housing project. Throughout the conversation, David felt a sense of tentative reconciliation, like two adversaries forging an uneasy truce for a greater cause. While David and Catherine found a measure of balance, David's relationship with Elena remained fraught. She resented how David's attempts at redemption centered around the Wilson side of things, feeling neglected and overshadowed. She had moved to a slightly larger apartment thanks to some funds from David, but it was still a far cry from the luxury life she'd once imagined. One evening, David arrived at Elena's apartment after a long day at the construction site. His son, now toddling around on wobbly legs, squealed at the sight of him. David scooped the boy into his arms, cherishing the embrace. But as soon as the child waddled off to play, Elena confronted him. "I can't keep living in limbo," she said, crossing her arms. "You visit, you spend some time with your son, but then you rush off. And half the time, you're working for your ex-wife's family." David sighed, sinking onto the couch. "It's complicated, Elena. I'm trying to rebuild my life to make sure I can support both my kids." "What about me?" Elena demanded. "I'm not looking for a handout, but do you see a future for us? Or am I just forever the mistress?" The question stung. David closed his eyes, wishing he had a simpler answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "Right now, I'm focusing on being a good father. Everything else, I just can't say." Elena's eyes welled up. "I believed in you, David. I never intended to come between a marriage, But when I found out about Catherine and how she ignored you, I thought we had a real connection. Now I'm stuck in limbo." Feeling overwhelmed, David attempted to comfort her, but Elena pushed him away. The tension simmered until their son toddled over, seeking attention. Both parents put on brave faces, but the unresolved strain threatened to undermine any hope for a harmonious co-parenting relationship. Months blurred by. The housing project, headed toward a successful completion, lauded in business circles for its cost efficiency and community benefits. Catherine publicly praised David's role, and though it raised eyebrows among the social elite, many admired the transformation. Some tabloids even speculated about a potential reconciliation between David and Catherine. Behind the scenes, tension with Elena escalated. She considered moving out of New York, possibly returning to her hometown to raise her son among family. One night, after a particularly heated argument, she issued David an ultimatum: "Either commit to a real partnership with me, or I'm leaving." David, torn and exhausted, found himself at a crossroads. He cared for Elena, and he cherished their son. But lingering feelings for Catherine and a desire for a stable environment for his daughter complicated everything. Ultimately, David asked for more time to sort out his emotions. Elena's departure loomed like a threat, but he couldn't offer false promises. One brisk morning, Catherine scheduled a meeting at the new housing site, which was nearing completion. She wanted to do a final walkthrough. David accompanied her, proud to showcase how all the features had come together. They passed through corridors of newly painted apartments fitted with energy-efficient fixtures and wide windows that let in natural light. Families would soon move in, transforming a once vacant lot into a vibrant community. At the rooftop, Catherine peered over the panoramic view of Brooklyn. A cool wind tousled her hair. David stood beside her, hands in his pockets, as they admired the fruits of their collaboration. "You did well," Catherine commented softly. "So did you," David replied, his voice matching the hush of the morning. For a moment they were silent, the city's skyline stretching in the distance, a symbol of ambition, mistakes, and second chances. Catherine turned to him. "I've been thinking. Our daughter is almost a year and a half old now. She's going to ask questions one day about her parents. I don't want her to only see bitterness. I want her to see that people can grow beyond their failings." David nodded, emotion thick in his throat. "I want that too." Catherine let out a heavy sigh. "I'm not saying things will ever be the same, but maybe we can be friends. Real friends who respect each other." He dared to meet her gaze. "I'd like that more than anything." In that moment, the sun broke through the clouds, bathing the new buildings in golden light. It felt like an omen of hope, a sign that despite heartbreak and betrayal, life could be rebuilt. Catherine clasped her hands and stared out at the horizon, envisioning a future where her daughter could be proud of both parents, even if they weren't together in the conventional sense. And so, with a quiet understanding, they left the rooftop, ready to face the next chapter of their lives, no longer adversaries, but not quite lovers, co-parents, and perhaps one day, trusted confidants. As for David, he knew the weight of his mistakes would never fully lift. But he walked away from the site that morning with a sense of humility and a determination to keep improving, to be the father both his children deserved, and to stand on his own 2 feet without the crutch of anyone else's empire. Life doesn't always offer clean endings or perfect wrap-ups. For David, Catherine, and Elena, their stories continued beyond the final page, battling regrets, forging alliances, and redefining what it means to be a family. Yet their journey reminds us that betrayal can be a dark teacher, exposing our deepest flaws and compelling us to become better or sink further. David, once a privileged bystander in someone else's empire, learned how quickly life can unravel when we compromise our integrity. Catherine discovered the resilience of her own heart and the power she wields not just in business, but in shaping her destiny. And Elena found that love, no matter how passionate, can't be sustained by illusions alone. If you found this story gripping, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Every click helps us craft more tales of heartbreak, triumph, and unexpected redemption. Your support keeps the stories alive.